Cool. So, as I said, we're going to get right into this. So I'm just going to introduce you to the moderator, who's Tim Hardy. He has an extensive biography, but that spans decades. So I'm just going to keep it short. He is the co-owner of Sound of Pop, which is a music publishing and master sync representation company based in Nova Scotia. Prior to doing that, he was with SOCAN for more than 22 years. Is that right? More than 22 years. And living in Toronto and Halifax, and he was the East Coast representative for SOCAN when that position was still existing. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight Tim Hardy, and I'm going to let you guys take it from here.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming. What I'm going to do, if everybody, maybe I'll introduce everybody, and then everybody can sort of give a brief explanation as to why they're here and why everybody wants to know what you need to know. So maybe we'll start at the end with Rosalyn Dennett.
Hi, my name is Rosalyn. I work with the Canadian Federation of Musicians at the national office, and my role there is licensing and outreach coordinator. So a lot of my day-to-day was in working with music supervisors to get AFM recorded product synced. I also help people out in figuring out what kind of contracts they're going to use when they're doing their compositions for film, television, and commercials, and a whole other slew of stuff. I'm also an artist as well and a member of the AFM.
Next to Rosalyn is Duane Ends.
Yeah, hello. Breaker, check 1, 2. Is this on? My name's Duane Andrews. I live here in St. John's, and I'm a local musician. And I have a few plates spinning in the air, usually at all times. And one of them often has a fair bit of screen composing work on it. So I've done maybe like 30-odd films now over the last probably 20 years. And ranges from shorts to docs to feature films to pretty broad range of things. So I guess maybe I'm bringing a little more experience from the trench.
Yeah.
Good, thanks. And Rozalind MacPhail.
Hello there. So I also live in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and I am really excited about live scoring for film. Mixing live music with film, particularly silent film, but I've also done a lot of sync placement with my original music, and I also compose mostly for short films, but I've also worked on features. And I'm really excited to just share different ways to be creative getting into the film industry, because there's not just one way.
And I'm Sandy Morris. I've been working as a musician for years and years and years. My first television appearance would be 1965, and my first film experience writing for film would have been 67. I'm about to start actually well into my 25th season of Land and Sea for television. So, enough.
And my name is Tim Hardy. I'm from Halifax, and I'm here to moderate, and I can certainly talk about sort of the role of a publisher when it comes to sync and rights, royalties, how to actually get paid. Yeah.
If everybody could close mic a bit, that would really help with the sound.
Better now? Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
Can I get an echo machine on this thing? Oh, come on, it's a film workshop.
Thanks, Dan. All right, so we can get started. So the actual workshop is called Scoring for Film: What, Where, and How. So I think what we're sort of going to go through tonight is the what is film scoring. It's going to be simple stuff. What is film scoring? How do you do it? And how do you get paid? If anybody else wants to know any more than that, I think we could answer any questions, but those are sort of the basics. So I think maybe what we'll start with, and you sort of started a little bit, but maybe we could go to you, Sandy, and everybody can sort of talk about sort of maybe how they got into, so I'm sure everybody's story is a little different about how they actually got into film scoring. Yeah. So maybe how you got into film scoring and sort of what that was like.
Well, for me it was totally fluked. Like everything in my whole entire career, I just sort of fluked into being in the right place at the right time. Playing in a band here at one in 1967 called Philadelphia Cream Cheese Band, and a guy from the National Film Board happened to hear us and asked if we'd do some music for the Fogo Island films that they were working here at the time, a whole series of kind of documentaries that really changed the social fabric of Fogo Island. Fogo, as you may or may not know, was about to be resettled, and the people in Fogo decided, no, we're not going to go. And they just decided they'd stay there and make it work. And as part of that process, the film board, like film public meetings and people's, getting together and talking about what they were doing, how they were doing it, why they were doing it. It was a fantastic series of films that eventually went around the world and instigated, social change and community building all over the world. Anyway, so I fluked into having to do that film and had to join the AFFM. Been a member ever since. I ended up, like I said, doing a lot of work on television in front of the cameras, and eventually that, somebody would need a theme or somebody would need some underscoring, and sort of snuck in that way, and then eventually got to be the composer and post audio guy with Codco, and did 5 years of that. And then it's really interesting. I was working in Toronto on the Codco show, and the guy I was working with said, "So how do you keep your skills up when you're home?" And I kind of chuckled and thought, there wasn't that much of a film industry here back in those days. So how you would get a gig on film, I had no idea. And the following year, Pauline Thornhill called me up and asked me to do the music for Land and Sea, and I've been doing it ever since.
So that's the key to being in film is getting the gig like Land and Sea.
The key to being, for me, the whole key was just being around,
Right.
Seriously. Yeah.
And Rosalyn, I'm sure your entrance into film scoring was you were obviously you're a performer as well. So your film scoring wasn't the first thing you got into. So tell us maybe a little bit about how you got into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the time, I was actually living on Vancouver Island, and I was new to Victoria, and I was part of this party scene, this arts collective called The Project. And there was a filmmaker that I was absolutely captivated by, an experimental filmmaker named Scott Amos. And it's interesting how sometimes, spending our times and immersing ourselves with really inspiring people can take us in different directions. So I actually fell in love with this filmmaker. I just was so fascinated by him that we actually became a couple. And I offered to start writing music for his silent films that he was doing. And he was like, "We need to try this live. I want to project my film, and I want you to play this live score." And as soon as we did it at the project and played it in front of an audience, I realized at that moment how special that combination is. And, fast forward, I moved to St. John's 10 years ago, and I had been doing all this work with Scott. I had also met tons of filmmakers along the way as I was touring my own original music across Canada. And I wanted to get into the film scene here because I was so passionate about that combination. But I didn't know, as a live performer writing my own music, how I could connect with those filmmakers, what I could do. So I actually started taking courses at NIFCO. And I took the beginner's filmmaker course. And I love it, Sandy. And I took the beginner's filmmaker course, and I offered to score that film, and loved being able to do that. From there, I started to meet different people in the community who were part of the NIFCO film scene. And it was the Nickel Film Festival, actually, that really gave me my first break doing live scoring for film, because they had this amazing program where you would be able to do the Super 8 movie. You get paired with a filmmaker who is making a Super 8, and then you get to perform in LSPU Hall, playing your own original score to their film. So I did that, and I just knew from there that this was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
How old are you now?
45.
And Duane, I guess everybody's story is pretty similar. Everybody is a performing musician outside of film scoring. You obviously were prior to starting film scoring. So was there? Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, for me, my experience was. I guess I was somewhat established as a musician, but I had a friend who was a director. So this was maybe it was mid-90s, late 90s. And she was making her first short film, so she was looking for some music, and she just asked me if I felt like getting involved. And I think at the time I'd just gotten a fiddle, so I did the whole score with just this fiddle that I could barely play, but it was fun, and it was very, I guess, experimental in a way, but it definitely wasn't. There was no budget, and it was just very artistically driven. But it was a great experience. So we did that and felt it worked for what we wanted to do. But then it was maybe half a year later, and she comes back because now she's got actually not a more serious film, but something that has a more substantial budget and required a more intricate score. But basically, because we had developed something already, she was happy with the way that went, and that led to the short that she did, which led to another short which she did, which led to a feature which she did. So kind of as she was starting to develop as a director, I was really starting to develop along with her as a composer. And then, kind of from there, and also like you're saying, Sandy, I mean, there's not a lot of activity at least in our local scene. So I think, part of it was just me being somewhat, known as someone who does that. So then, kind of through the networking and just being in, kind of the front of people's brains, when they're looking for someone to write music. I think that certainly helped a lot as well.
I think that's the whole name of the game. Like you do one project, and someone says, "Oh yeah, he did this film," and so now we're doing a film, so let's get him.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and yes, I mean that's basically my, and then from there it just kind of started to. But it's funny because I've been listening to a lot of different. Because often what I do to procrastinate is study film scoring and histories and things like that. And
It's called practice.
yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, one thing that I did notice in a lot of different people's stories, like people like Michael Dana and establishing Howard Shore, really it is that same thing. They started with a young student filmmaker,
Yep.
and with Howard Shore, it happened to be Lorne Michaels, who was off and does Saturday Night Live and all that, and with Michael Dana, it happens to be
Adam
McGoy, and then that all leads up to Life of Pi, So, but that is a pretty common, I guess, a natural path that often happens. Is you just meet, so. You meet an emerging film composer, you meet an emerging director, and things go from
So where do you? So for somebody who was sort of trying to get into that scene, and maybe they don't live in St. John's, for example, where I'm assuming the majority of the film production crews and films are made probably here. So where would you recommend? Where would some of those other places be? With if you're living in Corner Brook or you're living in Gander or something, or in Labrador, there obviously would be a scene or some version of a scene there probably. But how do you find that? Or if you wanted to start to develop those relationships, maybe with somebody in St. John's or somebody in Toronto or somebody in Halifax, how do you what would be some?
Yeah, well, I mean that's a whole that's a very deep and important aspect of everything we're talking about, because things have changed so much, and before it even would have been the question, well, if you're in Toronto, really you should be in LA, or if you're in Newfoundland, if you're in St. John's, you should be in Toronto, or if you're in Corner Brook, you should be in St. John's, and I mean just the technology and the creative process has changed so much that
Absolutely.
you can kind of be anywhere, at least technically,
to do the score once you've established that relationship, and definitely. It's just getting that relationship, I guess.
But so I guess if you're going back to that question of just how do you connect, I guess maybe would that be it? Yeah, I mean there's all the things like coming to things like this, just going to events, whether it's a film festival, just anywhere where filmmakers are hanging out. If you can start to just be among those people, then
absolutely.
eventually something will happen.
And they're not really looking, like you said, everybody's story started out as I'm not a film composer, I have no idea how to do it, right? It's you work, you develop those, so don't be afraid to introduce yourself to that young up and coming filmmaker, just to say, can I do that score?
And that's a great point.
Let's screw it up together or whatever. Right?
Yes, but even that alone, like how many people start with the intention of being a professional screen composer. I mean, it happens more so now because there's more programs established and all that, but
and more training kind of available and stuff too, courses and stuff.
But I think so often, probably the majority of cases is just more of an organic, I suppose,
It's certainly like the artistic scene in St. John's in the 70s, 80s, the 60s, the 70s and 80s was really not that huge an amount of people that were involved in the entire art scene. So, if you were playing in a band, then actors and film directors were coming out to see you. You know what I mean? So you got to know people just socially because you were out in the public playing. And then, every now and then somebody could say, look, I like the way you play guitar, and that maybe you could play for my film. right? The series, that's, yeah.
I just wanted to throw it out because I feel like we might have choked the flow a little bit here, and we didn't quite make it to the end of the
Yeah.
story.
I was just about to ask. I was just about to ask actually. It was because you and I had talked about Rozalind. You and I talked about some of the questions that you get at the office, like supervisors and people calling in. Is that something? Do you sort of help to make some of those connections sometimes? Is that something that you've done?
Not so much in that at that stage, I guess, of the process. But certainly we've we've been invited out to a couple different incubator programs to speak, which has been nice. So it's neat to see that those this Canadian Film Centre does an incubator program for specifically for screen composers there. And even when I remember being in when I was in music school, taking composition class there and having collaborations there between that and the film program there, which I'm sure there's budding. If you want to look for budding filmmakers, there's an art school out there with a whole nest of them, I'm sure. Yeah, and generally when when we're chatting with people, it's a little bit past that stage. They've made that connection already. So
Right. So I guess when once everybody has maybe started those relationships, maybe you guys can talk about a little bit about those relationships. Maybe Rosalyn, maybe that you had mentioned the first. We end up being a couple, so maybe that's not the recommendation for everybody.
I have a cool story.
If you want to it's hard if you want to do 50 films, right? But
well,
so what is that relationship? I mean, there's a personal relationship for certain things, but obviously there would be that working relationship, and how does that develop, and how does that change, and how is it maybe different from that very first one that you did, where everybody's sort of trying to feel out how to do it, to maybe more one of the top end production or a bigger production that you did that had timelines and bigger budgets and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, my career has been completely different than that.
So you're the wrong person to ask?
Yeah, I would say Duane is more appropriate for that, but I do have a story to share. I do think that, the most important aspect of the film industry is personal relationship, and you just never know where you're going to make that connection. So I do agree with Duane and Sandy in saying that, it's really important to get out as much as you possibly can and introduce yourself to people, because you just never know where it's going to go. And I'll give you an example of this. I was at the St. John's International Women's Film Festival, and this was, I had curated my own audiovisual projects, but I had never worked on a feature film before. And I was really eager to kind of move things forward. And I saw a woman, a director from Toronto, that just blew my mind. Her name is Ingrid Pfenninger. She's now working on her, oh my gosh, I think she just completed her 7th feature, and now she's on her 8th. She was one of those women that when I heard her speaking about her life on one of a panel similar to this, I went, oh my gosh, I need to get to know this woman. Like, she is just so fascinating. I had never met anyone who she just no is not part of her vocabulary. She will just go for anything she wants to do. And she's a powerhouse in the Canadian film industry. So I went up to her afterwards and stood in a long line because everybody wanted to meet her. And I just said, I need to get to know you. Is there any chance that you would have time for a drink or a hike? I just want to spend time with you. And she was so open to that. And what was so amazing about it is that we immediately built a friendship. And this is some of the things that I've done in my career to really build those friendships in a meaningful way. What I did is I offered to her that I would take her back to the airport with her husband. And her husband happened to be a music producer, so it was a really good opportunity to meet these people. And I knew that her film, it really touched my heart, the film that I saw. It was called I Am a Good Person, I Am a Bad Person. And so I thought, what can I do? What can I do to just make this really special for this woman as I pick her up? And I've got this old 91 Buick Century station wagon with wood paneling, right, that I'm driving. And my boyfriend at the time was a visual artist, So I got him to draw 2 posters for me. The one poster said, "I am a good driver." The other poster said, "I am a bad driver." And I put it on the front and back of me. I made all these homemade muffins with partridge berries, and I took them to Cape Spear before they went to the airport, and I just wanted to make this such a special experience for them. Well, of course, it touched their hearts so much, right? Like, it's a pretty special thing when somebody goes out of their way to really recognize what you've done in your own artistic career. So we became instant friends. Years forward after that, we're at a party in Toronto together, and Ingrid was like, "I want you to do a live score for this feature film I'm working on. Would you be open to it?" And I was like, "I don't know if I can do that. I've never done a feature film before. I really don't know if I can do this." Like, all that kind of insecure stuff that we go through in our careers, I didn't think I was capable of it. I didn't know Logic. I didn't know Pro Tools. I felt like I didn't have the tools it took to actually score this movie for her. But you know, this woman had inspired me so much, and no wasn't part of her equation. So I said yes, and then I scored that film, and it took me all over the US and Canada. So that's just a story of how you can build those personal connections, and sometimes the jobs won't come immediately, but if you develop those relationships over time, they learn to trust you, they learn what your strengths are, and then they'll ask you for that opportunity to happen when it's ready.
Yeah, and sort of keeping on that topic for the, again with the relationship, maybe talk about some of those, both Sandy and...
Here's what I've discovered about working with, well, directors or producers. Depends on the nature of the project, because, in documentaries you don't really have a director, you have a producer or whatever. Is that they've been associated with the project for years. You come along at the very bitter end when they've run out of money and they're past their deadlines, but they know exactly what they need way more than you do, because you just stepped into it at the last moment. So the most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is to really pick the brains of the person who's been working with that project for for 4 or 5, you don't know how many years, from the inception, from to script to everything, funding, the whole works, and to trust their judgment on it because they know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically where I come from.
Duane?
Yeah, and I mean, and there's so much, even with your example, Rosalyn, it's great because she's a fantastic director by the sounds of it, and I mean that's another thing as well is the director has a vision, and usually even when they're making the film, I mean every director will be different to a certain degree, but there's probably a musical vision that is taking shape as well. So even though you might not have felt ready for it, I mean she knew your music and she knew what she needed for the film.
Yeah.
And probably, and like you're saying, it was an improviser, it was a live performance. So often it is directors who can make you do something that you weren't even aware of. But also the cool thing about that is, I mean, the timeline is such a unique thing. But I mean, I think like anything in the music industry or the music business, like it's long term, and nothing happens overnight.
Yeah. I
mean, so many times you meet someone. I mean, I just finished a film, it was a couple of months ago now, and I first met the person in like 1998, I think. And we were actually doing it might have been a CFM. It was during the Atlantic Film Festival, and so there was a workshop where composers got paired up with directors. So I just first met her back then. But then it took, I think, 10 years after that. And we met and we did that's what it was. She had a scene, so it was an exercise basically. So she brought in a scene from a film she had. And then I scored the scene. And it was nice because we actually got to work with Symphony Nova Scotia and did a full orchestral thing which got recorded. I mean, it's a great experience. But just a workshop, exercise basically. But that all went well. It was probably 10 years, and then she comes and says, "No, I actually have a documentary that I'd love for you to score." So we did that, and then it might have been 10 years after that again. No, we did 3 films together. But it's that type of thing where because even the gestation period of a film can be decades. I mean, if it's a feature, from the time you get everything in place and all the development happens. And like Sandy is saying, it is always at the very end usually that music comes on board, just because of the nature of the process and. So it can be quite an amount of time that passes between opportunities, I guess. So yeah, but once you're aware of that, and and if you're a committed musician, then and you just remain dedicated and keep the faith, then slowly over time, all these things start to bubble together.
And what is that?
Can be a long
what
time.
What is that process? So maybe walk through a little bit of once you've established the relationship, you have the project. So where do you we'll assume it's composing. So where do you as the composer sort of start? Who do you have that initial conversation with, like Sandy had mentioned? But like who has that vision? And then where do you take that?
So kind of like just a case study of how to actually score.
Sort of obviously we know it's a longer, sometimes a longer process, sometimes a shorter process, but obviously it's not your first score and the first thing you present to them. They're not going to say, this is the most amazing thing I've ever heard. This is exactly what I wanted, right? There's a process there. There's a few things which I think are probably standard. And as Sandy mentioned, the first thing is you got to know who your contact person is.
Yes.
So often if it's a feature film, it's probably a director. If it's a TV show, it might be a producer or a showrunner. But just for the sake of an example, we'll say it's a director. So that's the person on the filmmaking team who you're working with. Because if you get a director and a producer and you get conflict, that can be a challenge. But usually you got one person that you have the relationship with. So then, say probably the standard process would be they've already got the film, probably they got it shot, there's some type of an assembly together, so they have a big cut that they'll cut down to a rough cut and cut down to a fine cut and cut down to a picture lock. So you can kind of come on board at any point during that process of the edit. But usually after there's something that you can watch is usually when you'll be approached. And then often what will happen is they'll have something called temp music. So temp music is temporary music that they put temporary, that the director and the editor will find that they'll place in the cut of the film. And it can be used, it works great for a few different reasons. It helps them to actually make the cut. Sometimes they'll even literally cut the picture to the rhythm of music that's in there. Or it can help just to give a sense of spotting, so where actual music happens in a film. So if you got a 90-minute film, and you might have 40 different little pieces of music in the film, so you can use the temp music to help you at least get a sense of where the director would like music to happen.
So that would be, so people don't understand that the definition of spotting would be
when I guess music happens in.
When you're going to start, when you're going to stop, kind of thing.
Yeah. So usually you get a cut, say there'll be temp music in there. And then, that's when it becomes, then it's kind of the negotiation. So the good thing with temp music is it's a good reference in a lot of different ways. The bad thing about temp is that people fall in love with it.
Filmmakers fall in love with it.
Yes.
They're used to cutting this film to the Rolling Stones, and they hate to let that go.
Well, a great example is Star Wars. So with John Williams, iconic, classic, great reference of a film and a beautiful score. But they were using music from, I think it was Gustav Holst's The Planets. Korngold was another composer who kind of had that large romantic sound. So they were putting all this music in the cut for temp music. And then, suddenly they go to John Williams. It's like, well, this is what we want. John, what can you do? So if you listen to, there's a few clips on YouTube where you can, they play them back to back basically. So it's like, here's, the opening, Darth Vader's theme or whatever it is. And then here is Gustav Holst's The Planets. And you hear, there's even, it's the Korngold, might be the violin concerto. And it starts with bum, 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 bum. So the very opening phrase is basically verbatim of what John Williams had in the main theme of Star Wars. And I think there might have been a legal thing that they had to settle at some point. So, but that's kind of the standard,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'll often refer to a piece of music that I know to come up with a new piece of music, but they either the tempo or the groove or something about the piece that you're referring to works for the cut of the film, right? So you end up with a completely different piece of music, but it's inspired by somebody else's music.
Yes, yeah.
And going back, I guess, because you have that, and then you're really following. That's sort of what the director's sort of thought of that film is supposed to sound like.
Well, and another, I think, fundamental thing to at least be aware of is that when you're a musician working on a film, still fundamentally you're a storyteller, and you're part of this team that is telling a story through film. So it's I guess, somewhat understandable and maybe even easy to kind of default to just thinking of the music on its own. And you might write a piece of music for a scene, and you're like, this is beautiful. Listen to the, the strings and the way that this is arranged over here. But it could be completely wrong for the scene, and just the way that the story is being told and what that moment needs. So I think what I was trying to get at there was how it really is the director's vision that, I mean, you can try to argue with a director, but that's not really,
They'll find another composer.
it's not really going in a good direction. But just, I think that's a fundamental thing, is that your job is to bring music, and that's another element of the film that is helping tell the story. So keeping it in context.
I like keeping the director or the producer, whoever it is, in the loop. So after I've got some cues written, I'll have them in the hair, make sure that I'm going in the right direction. Can I tell you a story about a film that I failed at? I had to do a half-hour Christmas special about a Christmas elf. And the filmmaker came in and we had a meeting and we talked it all over into the spotting session, yada, yada. And then she went away for 3 weeks. And when she got back, we were like 2 or 3 days away from the mix, the film mix. So I went ahead and wrote the score, but the elf kind of creeped me out a little bit. So every time the elf came on screen, I had kind of spooky music, and a little bit uncomfortable. And when she got back, she said, yeah, she says, your music is really good. She said, but every time you see the elf, it's kind of scary. I said, yeah. She said, well, our target audience is 5-year-olds. So I had to rescore the whole picture in 2 days because...
Communication is key.
Yeah, exactly. Communication is definitely
But this is one of the good things about temp music, is it can go, here's
Yes.
just a mood that this music has. So, I mean, you don't have to use the same instruments, but there's some certain quality that this music has that you can at least then have a shared reference. And another thing that I always do is on that, early on in the process when you're working with a director, is just find, like, I'll go through so a cue, by the way, is the lingo for a piece of music that goes with a specific part of the film. So say you got, the opening scene has that opening piece of music, so that's probably going to be your first cue. So what I always do is start with the first cue and go through the whole film and get an actual emotional description of what the director is looking for that scene. So what do they want that cue to contribute to the story at that point?
What would some of those sort of descriptive words be?
Well, it might be simple as we want it to be a little, spooky and
Spooky
edgy.
elf-like?
Or you might want something that's you just want it to be, sad and scary or suspenseful, but emotional terms. But if you start getting into, we'd like to use an oboe here with, maybe starting around middle C for the melody. Like, once you get into musical terminology, usually it's just so subjective, and it's easy to be talking about different things basically with the same words.
Do you ever work with script first? Do you ever start with a script?
A couple of times, yeah. And that's always great too, if you have that privilege of being able to be on board before the film is shot.
Yes.
That can really just make things go, be so much more deeply integrated.
I ask for a script with Lancy every week because a lot of times, the show will open with a guy sailing across the harbor in his boat, or going up the trail in his skidoo, or whatever. And you don't know if he's going off to check his rabbit slips or to find his dead brother. You know what I mean? So you want to have you want to know the story before you start to score, because you might be, like having some happy-go-lucky guy going off hunting, or he could be going to look for his family who are missing something.
But I wonder too, should we touch more on, I guess I'm talking a little bit about that part of the screen composing world where you have a film and you're writing original music for that specifically. But I don't know if maybe half of the world, is developed into this other way of putting music and film together, which is licensing. So you take music that's already written, so you might have your own catalog, and you can, whether it's...
That was my next point.
Yeah.
What is the difference between a film score and sync master?
Yeah, so one is, you're writing original music for a film, or, for a screen project. And it's the same process. So that's one way, but then the other side is, I guess you'd call it music licensing or sync.
It's like library music. I've heard it called library music, or license for film music, whatever.
Yeah,
It's stuff that's written specifically for film, but instead of, like, for example, if you wanted to have an orchestral piece underneath for a cue, and you couldn't afford to hire an orchestra, you can go to a music library and get, for a relatively cheap amount of money, a cue with a full orchestra.
Yeah.
And you don't have to pay every single musician in the orchestra because you're just paying the composer, essentially. And he's already paid the musicians. right?
Yeah, that's definitely one side. Is on the budget side, it's
Probably
often,
the wrong panel for that one. But,
There's often it's cheaper basically to use licensed music, or you can find cheap music to license for a film. But also, I think it might have been Easy Rider was the first film to have like what they call needle drops. So that's when the score for that film was intentionally approached with a new from a new direction, which is like, okay, this is kind of set in, I guess it was the 60s, and they wanted music that was I guess that already had reference and context and a certain and it was rock. It might have been the first rock and roll score, I think, or something like that. But that was a very revolutionary approach. And then other films like Pulp Fiction, and you get a film that's that only has pre-composed licensed music in it. And so, I mean, one way to do it, as you were just saying, is to use it from more of a, we can't afford an original score, so we'll just license music that's already made and fit it in. But you can actually, that could be your ideal creative approach, is to take music that's, that you know of already and find, that might be the best way to approach it. But there are two different approaches is the point where.
yeah, and that's for us with the publishing company. That's what we do. So that's the perspective that we come from. We don't represent film composers.
Right.
It's not what we do. There are publishers that do that, but we don't. So we come to a project where, in this case, usually a music supervisor would come to us and they would send us. We either have a relationship with them, or they send us a brief that says, Duane has done the score for this film. We're looking for these 3 types of songs for the film, and then we would then pitch our artists specific songs. So they're looking for, I don't know, a country, slow 1960s country style song, and they use similar descriptive words to what you're talking about that the film score would do, and then we would then pitch our artists. And for us, we're not a library. We are it's artists, right? So we have artists that are the composers, and we represent it. So we would be specifically trying to put a 30-second or a minute clip of a song that we represent into that film for a specific scene, similar to what you're doing on a score, where you're looking to do certain scenes of the score or the overall theme or feel of the film. But we're on the publishing side, when we're looking to pitch for film, it's typically, as you know, like a 30-second piece here, or a little tiny scene, or a driving in the car scene, or whatever it happens to be. So
I once had to do a scene for Cogco, which was a Japanese shot movie about Americans being in Japan after the war, and they wanted the score to sound like Japanese movie music. So we're not looking for traditional Japanese instruments. We're looking for something that sounds like a Hollywood movie but has Japanese instruments referenced in the score, which would be something that would be a very expensive project to take on if you had to do it from scratch. Luckily enough, I found it in Chris Stone. Remember Chris Stone? Library he used to be there on Charles Street, I think. He had a whole bunch of quarter-inch tapes of this music that was exactly what I was looking for. Wow. Yeah, and like really authentic film, Japanese, all the great instruments.
Yeah. But this is good, because I don't know if we've really touched on the music supervisor, because that's, we've talked about film directors and film composers.
did I send you my notes?
Yeah.
That's my next one.
That's your next
Well, actually, if it's possible, I might just jump in at this moment.
Yeah.
Because at this point, I feel like we're at in the film composer and director or production company relationship is where you might want to start actually recording or hiring musicians to be part of that, and that's where the AFM will come in. Generally, we have a bunch of different agreements with different people. So our biggest one is the CBC agreement that we have, and a lot of musicians will kind of get their first AFM, CFM membership because they have CBC work generally, or a P2 visa, but that's a different panel. That's probably already happened. So a lot of people hear about us from working with the CBC, and so what we have is an agreement with them that essentially says that they will hire union musicians for their productions. So if they're commissioning an original score for a production that they're doing for film or television, then they're going to use union musicians on those recordings or have temporary membership permits. So, so that agreement that we have with the CBC can also be applied to other productions as well if they want to use the same type of agreement. We also have something called the Canadian Content Production Rules, which is our other big film and television agreement, which is what they would call a buyout agreement. So the big differences between these two are the way in which musicians will basically continue to have a relationship with the music that they're recording. With your CCPR agreement, the composer, whoever's putting together that and hiring the musicians, will hire them for a bit of a higher fee, and they will record the music, and then that's their bit. Is called a buyout. But that's generally what you would call it, is a buyout. So if that later goes off and gets, it's attached to the film. If they use it for something different, then that's a different discussion. But if that film or television show gets franchised or syndicated, the musicians they don't have a different relationship with that. They have already been paid for their work, and that's that. With the CBC agreement, if CBC licenses their program to Netflix, let's say, the musicians will recoup, they get, I think, 7.5% of the, I guess, like the gross revenue that they get from that license, which is a huge amount. Like, so, you know, if it's Anne being sold to Netflix, 7.5% of that is going to go to the musicians that recorded on that production. So the musicians will carry on a relationship with the production throughout what happens there.
So as a musician, what are their steps? What are the steps that they have to take to actually be involved with that process? Obviously, they need to be a musician. They would need to be a member of the union.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to the things that you were talking about, like what are their responsibilities, and what are the sort of the responsibilities maybe of the production company? Or
a lot of it falls on the. Generally, it'll fall on the. From what I've come to understand, it usually falls on the composer to decide what, like, unless it's CBC. If it's CBC, it's going to be union.
Yes.
That's that. If it's commissioned by them and written for that production. But otherwise, that decision of whether or not it's a union production is really up to the production company and the composer. Generally, and you can please jump in if I get this wrong, but I think a lot of times the onus is on the composer to hire the musicians. That it's generally not the production company working directly with the musicians, that the composer is the liaison there.
Yeah, I think probably the standard is so it's an all-in fee. So if you're hired on as the composer, then you're given a big chunk of money, and everything comes from that. So, so that becomes that question of how do you want to, where do you want to put the money? And then different things like CBC and NFB, certain production relationships require the CFM contract, and then others it is a choice.
But usually if it's going to be broadcast, it has to be under one of the agreements, right?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
On CBC or NFB?
On CBC or
Like Netflix for example.
No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't necessarily have. We don't have a direct relationship with them. So we have there's the NFB agreement, there's a CBC agreement. But if you're a private production company, that's going to be if you're not affiliated with broadcasters that have signed on to an agreement with us, then there might not necessarily be an onus to be on one of those. But if you're going to be for any sort of thing that's licensed to CBC, anything like that, it's always going to be coming through the union. Same thing with if it's an NFB thing, they're going to be checking with us to make sure that people have been properly paid and the paperwork's there.
And is that payment, is that a one? Well, you said multiple, I guess. So is it initially when it's broadcast, there's the fee that's paid sort of when it's completed, and then is there a secondary fee when it's then say broadcast on CBC, and then another fee? You said if it's then sold, it's based on the sale, or is it based on the actual broadcasting of it?
It would be, and there's, I think that there's the initial fee, and then the big thing is if it's syndicated to what they call it, like an OTT, like another if it's broadcast somewhere not on the actual CBC, that's when another fee will come into play.
Right.
So if it's taken out of the traditional place where you would find a CBC.
And would that be international as well? So if it was, say it was CBC initially and then it was sold to, say, BBC in the UK, would that the same product?
Anytime that it's going to be then syndicated somewhere else, then or broadcast somewhere else.
Then there would be a fee that would come from, say, BBC to the production company, and the production company would then, that's where that money is then shared.
Yeah, it would be a percentage of that kind of license deal, whatever their revenue is from that selling that program. And then the other side of it is what we call a new use fee, and the new use fee is if it comes into play mostly in the sync world, and I can talk a bit about that later. But the new use fee is if you take that recording that you've done for, like, let's say that recording that you did for the score for Kim's Convenience, and then they say, oh, we really like that music, we want to use it for a different production. That's a whole different thing. Then you're licensing that music for something else, and the musicians, because they've already recorded that, because they've already done that recording, they're not getting any of that license fee when it's licensed to something else. They might not be part of the master license agreement when it's put into a different program. So what they would get is a new use fee, saying that this is now gone to a new use than we originally intended it for, and they'll get a fee for that.
Is that something that the AFFM does and tracks down and all that, or is that the responsibility of the musicians that are on that project to say, hey, I understand that this project is now sold to Netflix and I haven't been receiving any money. Is that something that you need to keep track of as a composer and as a musician?
Certainly we've got I've had people call our office and say, I heard my voice on tourism, like, I won't say where it was, but I've heard my voice on this commercial and I didn't even know that it was going on. And generally in what we'll do is we'll try to track down, and we had a conversation the other day, or earlier today, and I heard my husband's banjo playing on a track on TV, and I was like, I know that banjo, and called him up, and sure enough, it was him. But that was, he was the case of what not to do. He didn't record it on a contract, so he never saw a penny of that license deal. And I looked into it for him, but other people have done it on contract, and it has been used, and we will go after and find that payment for them. We also get lists of everything that's been licensed from the major labels. So if they've licensed something and the musicians haven't been paid out, we'll find out that way. But generally, we have a very good relationship with the music supervisors. A lot of the supervisors will come to us before licensing something to find out whether or not new use payments are owed.
And maybe that's a good transition, maybe to Rosalyn number 2, to maybe talk about music supervisors. What a music supervisor is. What do they do? Do you work with music supervisors directly?
Okay, so we're getting into the land of sync.
Actually, before we do that, does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I was just going to, can I cut you off for 1 second? In about 10 minutes, we're going to turn the floor over to the audience to ask questions.
Okay.
I'm going to spend 40 minutes doing that, and then we'll go back to you guys again for the last 15.
Okay.
I neglected to mention that at the beginning. I apologize.
Okay. Dan, you're not allowed to ask.
Question. Rosalyn, I was aware a number of years ago when I was involved in the board of the local here that there was an LA office of the AFM tracking down and getting people paid for use.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still the case?
That is still the case. So in LA we have an office that is just dedicated to that sync and licensing, film and television. We call it EMSD, the electronic media world. And they have a person that will sit there and watch commercials or sit there and watch television programs, and will look at the credits of all these programs and find out, really tracking all this stuff to figure out and make sure that all the musicians have been paid. In the Canadian office, however, we have 1.5 people in the office that are in that department. So not an entire room of them. So we don't do that as much. We still do, we do it to the best of our ability. Honestly, it'll sometimes be that, we'll have, it's pretty grassroots in that if we'll look at the credits if we're watching TV and see if the CFM logo is on there or not, and we will, if we suspect that something has been, because we are in contact with these music supervisors so much, like any sort of Canadian production that's coming out, we usually have a bit of an idea of what's being used on these shows. So if something's, if we see something in there and we're like, what, I didn't have a talk with the music supervisor about this Steppenwolf song that they used here. I wonder if they actually went, we'll do our due diligence and go and check it out. Yeah.
So sync.
Syncing supervisors.
Yeah.
Syncing supervisors.
So it's always good to find out where your music fits in television and film. And sometimes you will have songs that you may not think will ever sync properly, but hold on to those songs because 20 years from now, you may get a sync placement for somebody who's looking particularly for that style of music and instrumentation. So the music supervisor is going around checking out tons of different conferences, tons of different festivals. They've got just libraries and libraries and libraries of music, and they're excited to collect everybody's music because they never know what they're going to need for their show. One thing that we can do as musicians is we can really make sure that we have everything in order so that when that music supervisor calls because they like our song, that we have all our paperwork in place for that. Is everyone familiar with stems?
Maybe we could take one step back.
Okay.
And maybe sort of explain, and I can do that.
Yeah.
People don't know what an actual music supervisor is.
Okay.
A music supervisor works with the production company, and their role is to, over and above the score, is to find music for the television program or for the film that fits with specific scenes. And most of those, that music would either be, say, my band's song on a record that we're taking 30 seconds and place it in, or what Sandy had mentioned earlier, maybe there's an instrumental, a Chilean instrument that they really need that they have to go find and they can't find it anywhere else, so they find it in a music library and place it in those scenes. So their role is to, as Rozalind mentioned, is to find music and collect music for different scenes and different things that they're doing, but also is to clear it. So it's their job to work with the composers or work with the music publishers to say, we really want to use the scene, here's the description of what the scene is, here's what the music is going to be used for, that sort of thing. Here's our budget associated with that, so it's an independent film and we want to use it for 3 minutes in the film for these 5 scenes and we have $1,000 to use it for that film. Does that work with you? Yes or no? There's a contract signed, and then it's done. So then maybe you can go.
Should we also just clear some other terminology like sync? I think it just generally refers to synchronizing the music with the picture.
Yeah.
So that's a common. And then there's 2 licenses usually that you got to deal with. So one is the sync license clears basically the writer,
the song, yeah,
of the composition, and then the master use license is for the recording of the song. So in the same way you might have consider like a mechanical license for reproducing copies of a recording, that's somewhat parallel to a master use. So you're using a master recording, so you need a license for that. But then you also need a license for the composition that is on the recording.
Yeah, so typically with the score, with the composition, you're getting hired to do the score. That score encompasses the creation of the music as well as you're providing them with the recording of the music.
Yeah.
When you're taking a song that maybe lives somewhere else, so it's on an album, say really as an example, so the song is on Sony Music and the publisher is my publishing company. Duane wants to use that song in the film. He reaches out and he says, okay, Sound of Pop owns the sync, owns the music portion of the song. So me as the music publisher can clear that. So I can say, yeah, great, you can go ahead and use the song for X amount of dollars, but I can't clear the master, I can't clear the other side because that's owned by Sony Music. So Duane would then have to go to Sony Music and say, hey, we're using this song in the film. Here's the budget. You have to give approval for that for both sides. Or if, for example, a lot of our music is independent, and the actual artists typically are the ones that own the recording as well. So what we do when we do agreements with bands is we have a synchronization and a master use agreement. So it becomes what's the term is called one stop, which allows the music supervisor or the production company to come to us to say, we want to use this song, and we can sign off and clear both sides of it, so they don't have to go to somewhere else. So once you're, I think we're going to do. What time are we doing? 7?
That could be a natural time to switch over to audience questions. I'll grab the microphone, but first, before I pass it over, can people online hear me when I'm talking like this? Or for the folks online, if you have questions, you can send them in. We've got people taking them. Have any of those come in yet? Sherry? No, none have come in yet. So yeah, we'll switch it over, and we'll take about 45 minutes or ish, how long it takes to ask questions from the audience for the panelists. Before we do that, I think Roz was about to speak about being prepared for when you get the call in STEM, so maybe you can finish your point on that before we move out.
Sure. So really important, something I've been discovering in the studio is I'm always creating different music and releasing different albums. And I've gotten into the habit when I'm in the studio doing the final mix to create stems of the parts in the songs. So for example, one stem may be all of the percussion. Another stem may be all of your vocals. Maybe you have another stem that is all of your keyboards and your kind of your texture sounds. Whatever you think is going to work for your music, because we all write different music, so it's kind of hard to describe what you would need exactly. But what's really important, if you do anything, it's to make sure that you create a mix of your song that has all the instrumentation without vocals. And then you can also have your one with vocals. But sometimes when they're trying to mix your music in with the dialogue, they need the vocals to be out of the song. So, we tend to, I feel like when we're in the mixing process and getting ready to release our album, it's the one step that we want to skip. And it's also the one step that the audio engineer usually wants to skip, because it's going to take a lot more time to bounce down all those tracks for what you need. But it's really important to do that step, and it's becoming more and more important to be able to isolate the different instrumentation in your tracks. I will give you a bit of warning though, and this is kind of like a story gone wrong, or a moment gone wrong for me.
Is there an elf in this one too?
I had a filmmaker approach me about using 3 of my albums in her feature documentary. So this was a lot of music, and I had all the stems, but I had the stems created that they were all separate parts. Like the cello was separate, the bass was separate, you name it, everything was separate. And I was a bit naive about the process, and I sent her everything so that she could work with it. And we were working remotely. She was in North Carolina and I was here. Well, she sent me what she had done with the engineer later on, and it was close to her being ready to release this film. And she had literally rearranged my music because I had given her so much freedom with all of these parts that she had. So I would warn you that you don't want to give too much away, because you could be surprised what will be done in that final mix.
I guess that on that same note, that kind of goes back to the point that we were making earlier, which is the relationship with the producer, right? Mm-hmm. Having that conversation. What's the expectation of the music use? When you're doing sync deals, that's always going to be in the contract. I'm authorizing you to do X, Y, Z. If you do A, B, C instead of X, Y, Z, then I have to be, we have to discuss that again, or there may be more money involved, or whatever it happens to be. But
it's a matter of keeping the dialogue going through your process, your recording and mixing process, to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. Because if you got the direction wrong,
Yes, communication is key. And that's the other thing I found too, generally in the whole process, it's like, you know, okay, you can do it as in you meet the director, you get all your notes, you go and you write it, you send it to them, that's it. Usually that doesn't work out the greatest. And it's just the more back and forth you can have. So, you know, from the very beginning, even when you're planning how to you know, because you might have a tendency to, you know, for whatever reason, just maybe there might be insecurity or something. You think, okay, I'm just going to wait till the last minute and I'll write everything, just give them to them and then run away. But really, the more you can have conversation and back and forth, that's really, because you can talk about it forever, and you know, you're not really going to be doing anything substantial until you actually got the score, or you got the cut, you're putting music to it, then the director can check it out and go, okay, no. And then you have something to use as a reference as well, so the more you can refine things with an actual practical combination of your music and the cut. But I want to go back as well to, because what you're saying, I mean, if nothing else, for people that are making, you know, recordings here with vocals, definitely do an instrumental mix of whatever you're doing. And I found too, in working with different engineers, it's not usually that much more expensive. It's like you got a mix done, just mute the vocal. I mean, you can probably get it mastered, but often if it's going into a film, it doesn't really, you know, unless you're doing crazy EQ or compression or something. But it doesn't need to be like radio ready if it's being mixed into a film anyway. So I've always found, you know, getting an instrumental version of an album done to be, you know, a couple $100 maybe for, you know, 12 tracks.
we you know, in my recording history, we always did what we call television mixes, which is the backing track with no vocals, so that you could actually stand in front of a television camera and sing it live with the same recording, right?
Everything that we pitch and that we get requested, probably 95% of it asks for the song and instrumentals.
Yeah.
Not necessarily stems, but definitely the mix.
Can we also chat a little bit about metadata? Does anyone want to talk about that, or should I talk about that?
I wouldn't even know what it was.
So music supervisors nowadays are really keen on metadata, and it's kind of their way to get all the things that they need in your song when they're considering your song for placement. So little things that you can think about is, you know, if you're with SOCAN, your IPI number, making sure that that's included in your metadata. So if everybody, does everybody know what metadata is, or should I explain what that is?
You should explain it for me anyway.
Okay. So it's kind of like the data that's part of your track. It's typically for your MP3. I think you also can do it for AIFF, I think, but you can't do it for WAV yet. And on the MP3, like if you ever go into your iTunes and you do your get info and you're looking at your track, you can see everything broken down, right? Like who the composer is, what the year it was made, probably the album artwork. But there's so many more things you can add to that helps the music supervisor, like your SOCAN numbers, like what your split is if you've done a co-write. So for example, on my most recent project, it's a co-write with another electronic group. So the collective, we have a 50-50 split on the residuals that are going to come in. These are the little things. Also descriptives, emotional descriptives of what your track sounds like. That can really help the music supervisor kind of place your music into that library that they're going to keep for years and may call you up later. So it's all these little things that you can include in the metadata to just make everybody's job a little bit easier, and they really appreciate it.
And the metadata is stored with your music file, is that the idea?
Yeah,
So
it's
when
in
you
the
select a piece of music, the
MP3.
metadata is there with it.
Now, yeah, exactly. And yeah, and it really helps supervisors sort your music because there's...
I think a good way to look at it would be, as an artist, when you're pitching for film and TV, the song, the email that you're sending with the MP3 is your business card,
Right.
Yeah.
right? So it's like me walking up to you, giving you a business card that's blank.
Right.
We had an amazing discussion. We had a great relationship with talking about music. Then I go back home and I can't remember your name and I don't know how to get a hold of you. So
Yeah.
same thing, think of the same thing with the track. So you send the track out, the track has, it might sound stupid, but it has the name of the track on it, has the name of the band, it has that type of information. The IPI number, which we'll get into a little bit later about cue sheets, that's how you're actually going to get paid.
Yeah.
Who the splits are. For us, when we're pitching stuff, we add things like contact numbers
Yeah.
Yeah.
that we represent. all of the songs and the master, or we represent one of the songwriters. The other songwriter is represented by Warner Chappell here, so you can contact that Warner Chappell for that specific song, and the master is owned by whoever, and then the information is on there. So then when that person goes in and loves that song, and they want to put it on the cue sheet and put it in the film, they know exactly who you are, how to get a hold of you, how to pay you, how to do all those things. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just want to chime in and say, if anyone has a question in the audience, put up your hand. I just saw two go up right away. All right.
You're walking up with...
I'm going to walk right up with the microphone, yep.
Great.
So here you go, Dan.
Are there others? I don't know.
There was one in the back, but you were first.
Should we do walking music?
No surprise. A couple of questions, areas where I'm vague. One for Tim is, was the customary thing when people were signed to a label that they would hand over their master rights as part of the contract that they signed? How did record labels like Sony get their hands on the master rights?
An easy way to think about it would be is whoever pays for the recording. So if you were signed with Sony and Sony paid for the recording, they own the recording.
How interesting, because many contracts in the old days, the good old days, had the artist paying back for all the costs of recording, packaging, promotion, touring, video. So in a sense, the artist would owe the record company those costs, but the record company still held those rights.
Could be, yeah. And sometimes, I mean, that's getting more into contracts and contract laws, but those are sort of things that you would want to think about, especially when you're doing licensing agreements. If your goal is to do licensing and own, I mean, you might want to own that. So in certain contracts, there could be things like, for certain years. So in that example, it was a recoupment clause that would be in it. Right. So here's the record label's recoupment fee, and take however long. It could also be a year. It could be you own the masters for 10 years. You own, things like that.
In any of the meetings that I've had with music supervisors, there's always two questions they ask. Mm-hmm. One is, do you have stems? And the second is, do you hold full rights? That is to say, do you hold sync and master rights? Yeah,
and that goes back to being one stop. So if a music supervisor,
that's right. And usually,
the less people the music supervisor has to get in touch with to clear, the easier it is, the more often it's going to be.
Exactly. Exactly. And usually for the artists that I worked with, we have that bundle, so that's not a problem. What the heck is an IPI number?
Oh, that's... Come on.
Or is that too complicated?
I know my number, but I don't know what it is.
You have two identification numbers for you as a writer. You have the membership number that's associated with your performing rights organization. So, for example, SOCAN. So you log in, you'll have a SOCAN number. No. So you have your SOCAN number. So you have a specific identification with SOCAN. Every performing rights society that you join has a specific, so if you're a member of BMI, you have a BMI number. If you're a member of PRS in the UK, right? The IPI number is assigned to you, and that's for the international database. So the IPI number is automatically assigned to you as soon as you join a PRO. If it's your SOCAN, if you look in your SOCAN profile, when you log in on the right-hand side, it'll say SOCAN number, it'll say IPI number. That IPI number is what identifies you internationally, which is why it's important to send it out and to have that IPI number on the cue sheet, because if you're adding your SOCAN number on the cue sheet and the production is a French production from France, they're not going to know that it's you because they have no idea how to track it down through the SOCAN number. They're only going to know how to track it down through the IPI number. But it's easily available to there. It's nothing you have to do. It's automatically assigned. As soon as you join, it's automatically listed there.
And if you were to join two organizations, would you have two different IPIs?
You always, you wouldn't join two, right?
Oh, no, you wouldn't here in Canada.
Yeah, you would have that's a good question, actually.
Yeah, okay.
I'm going to say no, but
if you joined two different organizations, Dan asked, would you have two separate IPIs?
That was the question. Yeah, my guess would be no, but I could be wrong. You definitely would have two membership numbers, one with each of the societies, but they may link the IPI number as one.
One thing that's important to think about that, I had this experience recently because I'm working on a new album that has a lot of different electronic music producers in it. And so we're doing a lot of co-writing, writing songs together. And so there's like 13 different music producers that are collaborating with me on this. And I wanted to prepare this album so that I could get a lot of sync, because I think it could have some opportunity for placement. But I know that it's really important to have that paperwork in place in order to make sure that clearing with a music supervisor is going to be super easy. So one thing I did is I actually hired an entertainment lawyer We're really lucky in Atlantic, Canada. We have one lawyer in particular I worked with, Matt Gorman, who is just a delight to work with. You work with him too, don't you, Tim?
Matt is also our lawyer, yes.
Yeah, Matt's really great, and he breaks down the language in a way that will make sense to you. So if you are finding that you're going to have some sync opportunities, definitely hire an entertainment lawyer. It will
I thought
really.
you were going to say definitely hire Matt Corey.
Well, definitely hire Matt. But
he just tweeted me.
But,
No, I'm just
yeah, but no, it really, really helps, and they're a lot more approachable than you think they are. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So we did a co-write agreement with all the music producers on this album, and one thing that was really important to talk to everyone about before we even release the album, before we even create the final tracks, is to make sure that we understand what the division of royalties is going to be. So for this album, I'm doing it that it's 50-50. I get 50%, each music producer gets 50%, and it's nice and even. But the other thing that was really important to put in that agreement was the IPI numbers, and there happens to be music producers from all over the world on this album, and so it was really interesting to discover how it works for everyone. And you know, there were a lot of musicians on the album that didn't even know what their IPI number was, but now they know, and it's going to really help with clearance down the road.
And that's valuable for a situation like that. It's also valuable just for a band that's working together. You know, four guys in a band, same concept. Because when you're doing a sync deal, if you don't have that agreement in place, all four members have to sign off. If they're all writers, all four members have to sign off on it. But you can also do a similar agreement where you've designated somebody to sign off on it. Then that makes that process easy and quicker. And and sort of goes back to relationships as well. So the same relationship you want to maintain in good standing with the producers, and all. You want to do the same thing with music supervisors, because if you tell them one thing and then they place the song in the film, and one of the writers who you said you have authorization for comes back and says you don't, or you own the master and you don't have rights for it, that relationship is screwed.
I got a question here from Sherry.
So we have a couple of Music NL members who've asked about this very topic, so hopefully they're tuned in. But my question as a new administrator for Music NL is, one, can you direct me in all your expertise in one little neat online resource I might share when folks have questions? And two, I'm curious about the process and your experiences with local film festivals and the broader Canadian film festival, some of the bigger ones. So not just the Nickel, but it could be the Hamilton, the Great Lakes, you know, the Toronto Film Festivals, that sort of thing. So share those experiences, and also a resource for me to share for the folks that do write for film.
I can quickly say, you know, one fantastic resource for people who are composers for screen is the Screen Composers Guild of Canada. And they're basically just, you know, it's an organization of film composers, and they do all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, it ranges from, there's, one great thing is just, it's an actual, it's like a forum basically. So, but, you know, all the knowledge that this community has, they're very open in sharing. So, you know, countless times I've gone and, you know, so there's an email list basically that you can send something to. So you might be like, you know, I'm trying to find who owns the publishing on, you know, this obscure piece of Russian music that, you know, is in this film that you have to figure out, and no one on the team, you know, has any clue. But, you know, the extensive reach that group of the Film Composers Guild has is phenomenal. So, I mean, there's resources just for information and education. They're also great in, you know, this whole new movement of actually lobbying for, you know, copyright reform in the digital world that we're into now. They do great things on that side as well. They actually have an official mentorship program. So if you're an emerging film composer, you can apply to this. I mean, I did this, I think maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I actually went to Toronto and mentored with 2 established film composers. That was all through the Guild. They got a whole bunch of educational resources. So, you know, even questions like how do you score a film, you can go into their archives, and there's, you know, video footage. There's a great thing they just started recently, which is, I think it's called like Ask Me Anything or something like that. So they'll get an established person in the film composing community and just, get them up on Facebook for an hour and people just fire questions at him. So they had Robert Kraft, who was he was the head of Fox Music. So everything from The Simpsons, all these iconic pieces of film music. He was a part of these things. So he was just there, opened up to questions for anyone who wanted to ask.
I'm pretty sure when you join, there's a whole bunch of information you get too. I think that a DVD about film scoring came with the membership.
That was that. So that's just looking for anyone who's interested in the actual process and the business of being a creative musician in the film scoring world. Highly recommend the Screen Composers Guild.
I have one to add too. There's a lot of online resources that you can tap into and other groups that you can tap into. One on Facebook that I absolutely love is called Perspective Forum. And it's great. I've actually found a lot of work through this forum. And it's film composers from all over the world, from all different areas of expertise, and it's a really supportive group, so I highly recommend everybody join Perspective.
Matt Gorman has written a legal guide to musicians, I think, or legal guide to musicians in Canada. It's free. It's on, if you just Google it. I think he did it through Music Nova Scotia, actually, because he's a Halifax-based lawyer. It's a great resource. Aspen May Music and Sound of Pop are a great resource.
Probably, sorry to cut in, but
no,
sure. But probably for most Music NL members, you'll have some that are aspiring film composers, and then probably the bigger majority are just recording artists who have music that could potentially be licensed.
Yes.
So maybe resources for that would be simply go to things like the ECMA and Music NL have been doing great work in the past of just bringing in music supervisors to network directly with people in the Music NL community. So any of those types of opportunities are highly valuable. Yeah, we can actually meet a music supervisor and there's also Wayne
every year
Warren
they do a great job for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, for people in the local community, I'm just going to throw Wayne's name out there because I know at least he was working a lot. Back when Republic of Oil was on the go, and I don't know if he's working on. I think Hudson and Rex is at Toronto. Is Wayne doing that one as well?
Mm-hmm.
But basically, often he's looking for Newfoundland connected music for the shows that he's working on. So people like that are actually looking for local music. So,
And all of those shows have music supervisors as well, right? I know Arpix is the music supervisor for Rex.
You can go to IMDb if you have a favorite show or a show that you go, I bet you my music would really work with this. And if you don't see the name of the supervisor in the credits, you can go on IMDb, and usually you can find the music supervisor that way.
And another a resource that when you're looking to pitch and do things with music supervisors, because that's another thing. It's one thing to to get a brief to say here's specifically what I want, but normally that's not your initial relationship with the music supervisor, right? It's maybe telling them who you are, starting in like a normal relationship. There's a great website called TuneFind. I think it's called TuneFind, and it essentially tells you every single song that's in every single show and film. So if you want to know that Tim Hardy is the music supervisor for these programs, you find that at IMDb. You can look on TuneFind to find out exactly what they're placing in that film or in that program. So you can say, okay, well I'm a death metal artist. I really want to get in Grey's Anatomy. Right? It's not going to work. You can look on the show. You're pitching stuff that isn't going to fit for that particular supervisor. Right? It just helps you be educated with what that music supervisor is actually doing. For us, going back to the film festival question, the second question you asked is I found the Atlantic Film Festival was always a fantastic resource. They had they used to have a music and image program, which has transitioned through the ECMA now, but that was specific to music supervision, where they would allow that you'd meet music supervisors and things like that. They still do that through ECMA now. They don't do it through the film festival. For me as a music publisher. The Toronto International Film Festival is great. We work with an organization called the Canadian Music Publishers Association, similar to the Guild. It's an association that we work with for Canadian music publishers, and they actually have a lot of programs where because our main goal is to develop relationships with music supervisors. That's who we're pitching our music to. So they do a great job with creating events where we can actually have one-on-one sessions with a lot of music supervisors from around the world that we may not normally be able to get access to. So all these different organizations do a lot of different things for their members.
The parties are pretty cool too at these film festivals, I find.
I didn't know, maybe Sherry, did you want to be like more specific on the aspects of the film festivals you're trying to
Yeah, it's pretty broad, but I mean probably the two key entry points. So one is either with a music supervisor, but probably for a lot of the films that you're seeing, that are on more of the independent side, there isn't a music supervisor, and it's just the director is really doing that job as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, just meeting directors, meeting music supervisors, those are the people that are making the decisions as to what music is going into film.
Yeah, but the small indie films and things like that, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. It really is the most important thing that you can recommend to them is just to be present, to be at these parties, to be at all the screenings, to really make themselves known. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, there is a guild of music supervisors as well, and they'll put on some events usually during TIFF or other things like that. They'll host a party or an event, a mixer of some sort, and if you look them up, then you might be able to find an event that they're putting on.
I don't get to raise my hand, so I'm just going to butt in. And, I'll get to you after me. So, I guess this is more so for the composers on the panel. I guess what do you consider the bare necessities or essentials for you to have in your own space? If say one of us out here wants to compose for film, we have a keyboard, some MIDI interface. There's kind of do you need the ability to record live instruments in your own space typically? Do you?
Yeah, that's totally changed again. And in the same way you can make a film with an iPhone,
yes,
you can probably even edit it on the iPhone these days.
You can probably score it on the iPhone too.
You can probably record your score on. So I mean, it's a similar thing too. That same relationship of tools. So how many tools do you need to do the job? So I mean, if you can do it with a hammer, then that's all you need. But if you need a full backhoe or something, then so situations are a little bit dependent, but really you don't need a lot these days.
No.
I mean, I was working on a film and I had it all on the laptop. I was over in Germany 2 weeks ago and I had to finish the film, so I took it all. And there's ways to make your setup more portable. Sometimes it isn't always ideal, and often if you get in, because samples are a big thing now, so you can get these big sample libraries which can take a lot of resources, but you can also there are ways that you can make it all fit in your backpack. But I mean, I would say you should, if you're a solid composer, then you don't need a lot of stuff. I mean, all that is just extra. But the fundamentals is minimal these days.
Yeah.
And you can do it. You don't even need. You can do it all with software instruments and even just one synth, or there's ways that you can get a variety of sounds, even just from a simple. Okay, but maybe to go back, what you need is a workstation, so whether it's Logic or Pro Tools or Reaper or Cubase or any of those types of programs, and probably something that in that program you would have a video track as well. So not every work. Like I don't think Audacity has a video channel, but all the industry standard ones have your recording sequencer and your mixer view, and then you can also put a video in there. So if you got that and a synth patch. And even if you use your musical typing keyboard, you should be able to do a film score.
Yeah.
A set of headphones.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll add to that too and say, we can get creative about how we create our scores. There's so many different sounds that we can create on the instruments that we're familiar with. And also, even when you don't know how to use the plugins and don't know how to use the samples in the library, sometimes you can create sounds that audio engineers die to be able to know how to create. And also, I would say that when it comes to what software you use, obviously there's standard ones in the film composing world that most people are used to using. But For my film composing, I use Ableton Live. That's what I feel comfortable with. And for me to spend a huge amount of time teaching myself Logic or Pro Tools, it's not where I want to be right now in spending my time. So I use what I'm really comfortable with. And that's how I capitalize on being able to create the sounds I want to create through that program.
I can't think of it. No.
Then Dan.
Yeah, I'm going to try and make this quick because I have to leave in 3 minutes. So I met a really neat music supervisor who visited here. Music and L set up meetings with him, a guy named John McCullough, who's very plugged into the LA scene. And the story I want to share is that when I was in Los Angeles in March, mostly visiting family, doing some research for a project, we had connected really well. So he was happy to see me, and we sat in a cafe in Sherman Oaks and talked. He said, well, they don't really want music anymore, he said. He was talking about the TV scene. They want sounds, and they want it cut and dried, and they want it cut to measure, and they want it quick. So I guess that, and the fact that it's often the film composer who gets to see the script last, how can you change that? I know that's a deep question, because we're all often the last one called, and they want sounds. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's kind of become very industrial. That's what he told me.
Right.
So
And
what can we do about that? That's my question.
I'm not sure if I understand exactly what the question
And is that
is.
relative to music placement or just film music in general and kind of the aesthetics that are emerging these days?
It's relevant to placement in the more high-profile scenes of television and film, where it's become more quick, more cut and dry, he says.
Okay. I mean, I could even see things like, maybe Lost, what might have been one of the first shows that had that really minimalist, it's almost like just suspense with just one abstract sound.
Yeah.
And then, that's kind of become a little bit more maybe prominent. But there was also a period where, when songs like, it'd be common for, every TV show, like in the last 10 minutes or whatever, to be a full song that would play like a music video.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a trend. So I guess these are things that are just more like trends that come and go probably in the film world. But it's definitely big things like having a full song with lyrics is more challenging to place as underscore.
Yeah.
There are shows now though that are focused on music, right? I mean, good Canadian show, Working Moms, is a great example of that. Very music focused, right? Peaky Blinders is another show, very, very, very music focused.
Yes. Yeah.
And This Is Us is another one. They use a lot of music, right? So I think it pendulum swings a little bit and something.
But it sounds like that's maybe just more of a stylistic sort of trend that he was referring to. That's what maybe Hollywood is looking for these days, is something that has that style.
Yeah, maybe more about the scene that he's plugged into there.
Yeah.
Because the music that I gave him when he was here, and that I was telling him about, including a local LA kind of bluegrass fusion band, he said, "Oh, the music's wonderful, but I don't think I have a market for it."
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But again, that may have to do with that particular slice of the industry.
Yeah.
at that particular time.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, we've had stuff in our catalog that we've been pitching for years and years and years. We got stuff that just hit. Right? Like we've been pitching for a long time, and we thought, what the hell's going on? And then all just out of the blue, right? So I mean, you just never.
I think it's always out of the blue, like you were saying, Sandy. I mean, so much of it is unexpected. Like if you look back at everything that you've done, and even the shows that have endured for so long, like I mean, how much of it was actually planned?
Very little. I love this a quote from a famous film composer from the 50s or 60s, and he said to the director, he said, "So how would you like your score?" And the director said, "By Thursday."
But it probably goes back to what you're saying as well, Rosalyn, which is that, okay, I mean, we're kind of establishing somewhat that we don't really, you can't really you can plan, but be ready for your plan to change drastically.
Yeah.
And be ready, I think is what I was going to get at. And you're saying just make sure if you're going for it, go for it. You never know where it's really going to go, but at least be ready so that when it gets there, you can make it happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes the music supervisors, when they actually are looking for stuff, once they bring it back, the producer says, "I want the exact opposite, almost," right?
Yeah.
So Yeah. So again, that goes back to the relationship with the music supervisor, where they can say, oh, well, they really wanted this industrial score, but when I get back to them, they changed their mind and they wanted a bluegrass band or something, right? And they have it, you have that relationship, and they can fit it in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I like what Rosalyn said about holding on to your old stuff, because I'm just about to release an album with friends, and my four tunes on it, I consider total crap. You know, throwaways, old stuff, but they like them, and that can happen definitely. And,
Yeah, you never know. Stuff that we pitched that we thought was going to hit, they hated it, right? And then they just found this other song and they loved it. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you just got to keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
there's no one way to do it. So,
I'm going to keep going.
Question for everyone in the audience. Who in the room has been composing for film? Okay. Who in the room wants to compose for film? Okay. And has anyone in the room had any sync placement? Yeah, okay. So it's kind of a mixed room, right? So one question I thought would be interesting, and you can let me know if you think it would be, is how do we make our money? How do we make our money? Can I invite that question for everybody on the panel?
Well,
How do we make our money in film and television? How about that?
well, you know, I make my money on CBC. Simple as that. And have for many, many years.
It's probably, you know, just again on you know, kind of the basics of it, there would be a couple of ways that the money could be made. So one would be if you're the composer, so then you get, as we were talking about earlier, you get an all-in fee, and so, you know, you can hire an orchestra if you want and spend all the money on that and not, you know, keep any for yourself. Sometimes that makes sense. Or you could try to do the whole score on your own, you know, so that, but that's one, I guess, revenue for you as a composer, writing in that way. And then more deeply with that as well, we've talked about a cue sheet, which is you know, the fundamental thing that keeps everything organized. So when a film is finished, a cue sheet, before we're talking about a cue, is just basically, you know, a term for a piece of music that's used in a film. So a cue sheet would have a list of all of the pieces of music that are in, and often, usually with the times that they're in, and then the publishing information is listed as well.
And the split and all that.
Yeah, so all those details, so that when it gets sent to well, in Canada it will be SOCAN, so the performing rights organizations, then they keep track of the people that are using the films. Tim, you can probably give a better explanation of this than I can.
Yeah. So every film documentary has a cue sheet. The cue sheet, like Duane said, basically explains everything that's within the film. So it not only talks about the music, but it also talks, you know, has the title of the film and who some of the actors are, who some of the production companies are, that kind of stuff. Year of production, a few of those things. Then it's typically the responsibility of the production company or the producer to create the cue sheet and complete the cue sheet. Sometimes that's done in conjunction with the music supervisor because they know the music that's in there. Sometimes it's done in conjunction with the film score, the composer. There's lots of different variations of it. But in theory, a cue sheet is completed. When it comes to back-end royalty, SOCAN, we'll use Canada, SOCAN licenses the public performance of music, so they grant a license to CBC, CTV, TSN, any possible television program that's out there. They grant the license, so they get money from that license. SOCAN's job is also to monitor the music or the shows that are being broadcast. So they'll get a list of every single show and every single program that's broadcast in Canada. That broadcast information is matched up to the cue sheet. That cue sheet then details all of the music that's in the film, and then SOCAN determines, based on 2 minutes of use in this particular film that was broadcast on CBC, here's the dollar value associated with that use. Typically, the production where the production is created is where the cue sheet is registered. So if it's a Canadian production, it gets registered with SOCAN. SOCAN has reciprocal agreements with performing rights societies around the world. So that cue sheet, in theory, gets then registered and worked with all of the performing rights societies around the world. Doesn't always happen, and it isn't always accurate. Always very, very valuable as a film composer if you're getting music placed in a film or TV show to monitor all of that stuff, to make sure that, one, the cue sheet is there to begin with. Just because they say it's going to be remitted doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be remitted. I always recommend either a film composer or if you're getting your song placed in a film or TV show, as part of the contract, to always request a copy of the completed cue sheet from the production company. That allows you to have that in your system. So then if they, like a lot of times now, if you look, like who reads all of their contracts, right? Everybody goes through. Not everybody. Typically there's a line item in the contract now that says we're going to remit this to a performing rights society. If they have no vested interest in doing that, so if they're not getting any money back as a publisher or something like that, sometimes it doesn't get done, right? They haven't read through it, they don't know it's their responsibility, right?
Yeah.
So then, if then you look on your SOCAN statement or you look in your SOCAN catalog and it doesn't actually show that cue sheet is in your system because it would be matched up to your system, then you can contact SOCAN and say, I have the cue sheet, please register. And that's literally the only way that you're going to get paid on the back end.
Yeah, and that's why I was going to interject that I always offer to submit the cue sheet, and they always say, yeah, you can handle that. And that way,
I always do that too.
Yeah, and you're in a good position because you have the score and you're doing a lot of the music, right? As an artist that has one song placed in the production, they probably don't have that opportunity, right?
No,
so
that's right, yeah.
so but it is there, but it would be something that they would want to make sure they have, and it's because it's always easier to get it at the beginning than it is to production. Anything that's created production wise, that it opens and closes and it's done, they move on to the next project, right?
Yeah.
5 years later, if you actually realize that your music you're not getting paid the royalties that you want to get, good luck tracking down that production company.
But so going back to just the fundamentals of where the money can come from. So one is if you're a composer, you get a composer's fee to deliver a score. But then also the music that is in the film gets logged on the cue sheet, and then that triggers a bunch of back-end royalties. So that's the second revenue stream. And so even if you're the composer who got the fee for composing the music, you'll also, it can be negotiated, but generally the default is you'll hold on to your publishing, and then that'll be a second royalty stream. And then that's where, if you have music that you've already recorded, so if you're a recording artist and you get music picked up by a music supervisor, then that would be on the cue sheet, so you get the back-end royalty from that. And then I guess another way is as a musician. So if we talked about composers networking with directors, but then there's also musicians networking with composers who network with directors.
Yeah.
And that's a different one, again, because I don't know if the CFM has changed. I guess there's a little bit of an issue there with standards, and often low-budget films, it can be a little out of reach, maybe, to do it in adherence with a CFM contract. Means there's a pay scale that has to be respected, and that's great. And are there special conditions, right, like small budget?
Yeah, we basically have the saying now, like, we have a contract for that, or we have a scale for that, whatever, at this point, because a big reason why the Canadian office created our own EMSD department was specifically because we know that the Canadian industry is different than, we're not dealing with the Hollywoods, right?
Right.
So we are actually quite flexible in how we approach, and we'll work with people on their budget basically to try and find a contract that will fit. And our interest is in getting the musicians on that contract. So we want to make sure that their rights are protected, that their work is protected, that not quite the right word, but they're kind of neighboring rights, so that they have that evidence that they've performed on that track. So if it does get used in perpetuity, that legal reference is there.
Great, yeah. But so that's another avenue basically for music NL members, for example, is to be performers on film scores.
Yeah. And so my contract is as a composer, but I'm also the only musician, so I get a music contract as well. So I have two contracts, and then the back end with SOCAN.
And also, one doesn't necessarily dictate the other. So the back end royalty is always going to be there. The front end royalty doesn't necessarily have to be there. And if you just say, for example, you as film score, you compose a score for an independent film that was broadcast on CBC, but there's no budget for the film score. Just because you didn't get paid on the front end doesn't mean you're not going to get paid on the back end. So you can always get paid on the back end, even if the film score initially was zero, right? Or the placement was zero, or it was something very minimal or whatever. You're always going to receive that back end.
Could I just get you to explain what front end versus back end is, in case people don't know?
In relation to the film score. So a front end royalty would be Too far? No? The front-end royalty would be the money you get at the beginning of the project. So for the film score, it would be the fee that you got paid at the beginning to create the film score. When it comes to placements, it would be the money that you received for the synchronization master use license, so that upfront fee. So once you've negotiated those contracts are done. So if you said $1,000 for the placement or $100,000 for the score, there's no renegotiating after the fact, right? The back-end royalty would be the royalty from SOCAN when it's actually broadcast. So every time that it's publicly performed, there's a continuous revenue stream for that.
And a good distinction is that, I guess, if I'm understanding your description correctly, the front end would be what the producers of the show, that's coming from their budget, whereas the back end is coming from, well, I guess it would be broadcasters or people that are licensing the show or using the show, and they got to pay their SOCAN fees or whatever it is. So it's a different, it's coming from different places.
And there is no, in Canada, there isn't a back end for musicians. So if you play on that, like different from your neighboring right, if your broadcast, like your audio work is broadcast on the radio, you would get a back end neighboring right royalty there from your MROC or your resound or whatnot. Actor acts. But for audiovisual, that doesn't apply in Canada. So you actually aren't making that back end, which is why we encourage people to pay scale when they're doing the initial recording or ask for a higher fee because you're not going to see that in perpetuity.
And on the back end, in Canada, you receive back end royalties for the broadcast of television programs. And films and movie broadcasts, so actually in theaters, and a few of the major film festivals in Canada. There's no back-end royalty for advertisements, so something to keep in mind when you're negotiating the fee. So if you negotiate a fee to have a song placed in a film or in an advertisement, or you're doing work for the score for the advertisement, all of your money is going to have to come from the front end because there's zero money coming from the back end, as opposed to television placement or film score. You can negotiate the front because you can maybe lessen the amount that you're getting on the front end because you know that television program is broadcast in 15 countries around the world, and you know you're going to get a bunch of money on the back end from SOCAN. So you can sort of balance those two out if you know where the money is coming from. The United States is a little different. The United States does pay in Europe. They do pay for advertisements, so they do pay for films for score for advertisements on TV.
Those are good points. I'm learning lots too. There's other ways to make money as film composers too. Who in the room is mostly instrumental? Is there anyone mostly instrumental? Yeah? Okay. So you can make production music. And there's a man on Prince Edward Island that makes a good living doing that. His name is Craig Dodge. I would highly recommend you reach out to him and learn from him. I met him at the ECMAs. I did a one-on-one meeting, and he blew my mind because I was always told, as a mostly instrumental musician and composer, that I would never be able to find any placement work because I don't have vocals in a lot of my songs. But you can actually create production music for all different vibes, styles, you name it. And you can actually formulate it in a way that it's not just a full song, but you can create little cues. You can create different Christmas music. You can create heartbreak music, whatever you're working on, and you can actually submit your music to production libraries. And another way to make money, and this came from the Perspective Forum I was telling you about. I met this film composer from Sweden online, and he's a wonderful film composer, and he was really interested in my flute sounds. So I spent a couple of days in the studio just creating a whole bunch of flute sounds for him that he uses in his production library. So there's that way to make money as well. Yeah.
When I was doing the Kako show and using a lot of production music, the biggest gap in the library that I was going to was for kind of Canadian East Coast music. Very little authentic fiddle playing and accordion playing in a collection, you know what I'm saying? So there was actually a hole in the market for local kind of Newfoundland music in production libraries.
And the only thing I would caution about music libraries, would be, there isn't an issue if you created new music specific for the library. But I would caution you about using music libraries with music that lives in another space. So if you have an album or a couple of albums out, I would be cautious about utilizing that music within a music library. If you want to use a music library or add music to a music library, create new things that are over and above what you're doing. Because on the back, going to the music supervisor side, most music supervisors will not touch the music if they know it's also in a music library. Typically.
Because anybody can use it.
Exactly. They would go specifically to the music library for library music, but if they know that your song, you're pitching your song to me, and it's on your record, and you also have it in 5 music libraries, I'd caution you about what you want to, if you can.
I want to throw it. I mean, I'm sure some members are engineers and work in the production side of things. I mean, that's another aspect as well of the film industry. I mean, it's different than composing, but I know there's a demand, and often when things ramp up, because there's different phases that everything goes through. But if there's a lot of productions happening at once, often it's a challenge to find a mix engineer for a film or a sound recordist for a film. So that's another substantial part of the local industry too, where there can be work.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be like production libraries and all that stuff. Doesn't necessarily have to be for. It's probably not going to be for local work. I know most of Craig Dodge's stuff is American, some Canadian, but a lot of it's U.S. based, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another example is Nick Fowler from New Brunswick. Nick scores for most of Bell Media stuff. There's a lot of stuff for that, and the stuff that he doesn't actually, because when you're writing production library music, you write 15,000 hours worth of music, and 1 hour of it gets used, right? Yeah. So you have all that other music. So he has created it specifically for that, and then just adds it to their library, and then they go and use it, and they just pluck it out whenever they want to, and that's the Bell Media Library, which is based in Toronto for tons of productions, right? So, like a lot of the B&N stuff and anything you can imagine that's Bell Media based is there, right?
Another point that I'd like to make about if you ever have the opportunity to score a film is keep in touch with the sound effects department. So, you might spend hours syncing up your big orchestral climax to hit with the explosion, but then the explosion sound wipes out your entire orchestra. So keep in touch with it. Make sure that you're not covering the same ground that the sound effects guys is working on.
There were no questions online coming up. Is there? And if there's no more in the room,
One question online.
so we have about.
Let's ask them something.
Well, I was going to say we have 12 minutes left. I guess typically throughout these things we've kind of throw it back to the panelists to just talk about any kind of burning things they would wanted to talk about but didn't get to, or if something new has come up to kind of just take a few minutes and discuss it. Maybe do you feel we can start on this end and move down, or?
Yeah. Well, when we were talking about making money, I just had a thought, which is, I get a lot of insight because I work with a lot of these music supervisors. We tend to see trends in what's getting licensed, and a lot of the stuff that the Canadian music supervisors are licensing is independent music, which is great. A lot of them are looking for, and maybe it's because they have, they have a cool vision and they want independent music specifically, or it might just be because they don't want to have to deal with maybe dealing with a record company that owns this and a publishing company that owns this, and they want a one-stop shop. Either way, it's a great trend that I've seen. The other trend that I've seen, if you want to make some extra bucks, is holiday music, because around July and August, our inboxes are full of music supervisors looking for holiday music, and there's and really actually quite hungry for that independent stuff, because otherwise it's kind of the same. You see a lot of the same stuff coming around, and so yeah, if you have a holiday song that you're sitting on, I would get it out there to those soups. I'm sure they'll be very happy to receive it.
They're looking for it in July, August, for December.
For December, yeah. So around the summertime is usually when sometimes a little later depending on what the production's like, but generally in the summer is when we start seeing people trying to clear those holiday tracks.
That's when we pitch our holiday stuff, is summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's when you record Christmas music, do summer.
Mm-hmm. And on the Christmas note, just funny we're talking about Christmas, but although it's kind of close to Christmas,
we're
really.
close
But,
enough,
two good things would be that if you're looking for types of music to do on that end, public domain music obviously is the majority of what they're looking for, and then original Christmas music would be another. Just I would caution if you're out there, if you're going to start doing a bunch of recording of Christmas music, don't do a lot of the famous sort of songs, because they're not going to license those. They're going to license probably the originals, right? Because the composer is probably going to get the majority or a big chunk of that money, and their budget's going to be there, right? So, yeah.
I guess we're kind of moving into final thoughts territory.
Yes, this is final thoughts territory. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go, just thinking about everything we've been chatting about, and I guess maybe think of the majority of the members, which are local, probably local either writers who are aspiring to be composers for film, or they're recording artists who already have a catalog that could potentially be licensed. I'd say still, the most important thing is networking and just getting out and meeting people. And and really, so here it's directors, and I mean, it's not so many music supervisors around here, but there's a great film community that has many different levels of development happening. So you're meeting a lot of first-time filmmakers. They're looking for musicians to work with. So yeah, I'd say and things like coming to these things, going to the ECMAs, going to Music NL, going to any places where people are gathered with that type of interest would be certainly highly recommended.
And these days, of course, you can find young, new filmmakers online posting stuff, and who are desperately looking for original music to go behind their movies. So there's opportunities out there.
Yeah, and another thing as well is, I mean, you can also cross you can be someone. I mean, a good example is Trent Reznor. So he became famous, I guess, and a lot of people really love his music, and then he sort of transitioned over into being a film composer. But that happens often too. Like a director will just love someone's music, and might not, that person might have never scored a film before, but because there's they just have I guess they want that music. So you don't need the skills of understanding the mechanics of how film is made. Sometimes you can, if you're just someone who can write a certain type of music that the director wants. I mean, that happens often as well too. Is a director will just ask a composer to write not specifically for scenes, and just write music in a certain style or a certain mood, and then that gets placed. So it's almost like creating a library specifically with a composer. But so if you're for someone who's a recording artist here, that can also sort of parlay into actually composing for film, even if you haven't done it before.
Yeah. Final thoughts. I would say really believe in yourself. I know it sounds really granola, but we can go through so much insecurity inside when we don't think we have enough skills to do what we dream of doing. And it's just really important to tap into your heart and really go for what you want. And like my filmmaker friend Ingrid taught me, just take away no from the equation. Everything is possible. If you really want to do this, you can do this, and you can carve your own path. For example, I'm not Duane Ends. I'm not scoring for strings, and I'm not, creating these lush scores that I totally respect Duane for. Instead, I create these niche music scores, and filmmakers will reach out to me because they like my particular sound, and they like my particular instrumentation that I use. But at the same time, I don't always just wait for the filmmaker to come to me. Sometimes I will curate my own projects where I will invite filmmakers to collaborate with me. And a lot of my most recent projects have been that I've invited filmmakers that I really admire to collaborate with me on creating a project together that I'm going to take all over the world. So sometimes it just takes kind of this open creativity and this open mindset that will help you find your own path that maybe no one on this panel has experienced before. And maybe that's going to be your magic in the film industry.
Lovely. I don't have any final thoughts. I do agree that, you really, it's an emotional process. if you can't connect with the emotions in the picture, then your score is probably not going to work. So you really have to be sensitive to, to what's going on, what the backstory is, and you have to be careful not to overpower a scene. You have to be careful not to be too cliched. You don't want every single cut to line up with a beat in the music. But the bottom line is really you really need to be able to make an emotional connection with the picture.
Maybe I'll approach it from the sync side a little bit when it comes to placements, because that's the sort of the world I'm in now. Make sure make sure the quality of the songs are great. Have a look at what you're competing with. Make sure it sort of stands up to what you're competing with.
You're competing with the whole world when it comes down
exactly,
to it.
Exactly. If your goal is to get into a big Hollywood film or a big something like that, look at what you're stacking yourself up to. Make sure not saying that it's not going to be as good, but make sure that it is. I'm sure it can be, right? Make sure the songs are great. Make sure the production is really great. Make sure all of that's there and different. Don't try to sound like somebody else.
If I could just jump in for a second,
Yeah.
because I think that's something that does get undervalued, maybe, like how great what you're doing actually has to be. And that's completely subjective as well, but you really got to put everything that you have into it to make it the best that it can be. And I just feel that gets underestimated or undervalued quite often. So I just want to emphasize that again.
Yeah.
It's got to be as great as you can make it.
Absolutely.
Because we're a publishing company based in Nova Scotia, but we're pitching to NBC and CBS and all those people, right? So we're competing with the luminaires and those that are getting placed in these shows. So we have to prove that what we're pitching is as good as those. Maybe a little bit different scene, you may not, but it has to be, because that's what they're comparing it to. Because they may have that other luminaire song that they're pulling out because of what you're pitching or whatever.
But along with that as well, echoing Rosalind's point, which is that you might be greater than you imagine or than you realize you are. So, go for it.
Duane and I were talking about this earlier, about she was asking what our percentage of our acts were from Atlantic Canada and stuff like that. And I said we're about 80% or something like that. Not because we're based here, but because we're based here, because we get access to all of this great music that other people don't have, and that's why we sign it. We can sign bands from other places or whatever, but we choose to sign a lot of the bands here because their music is as good. Or, the last little while it's becoming the quality of the productions and all that kind of stuff is like top notch, as good as anything else. And different and unique and has its own sort of quirks, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Cool. So thanks to Tim and Sandy, Rozalind, Duane and Rozalind, without the D. So this is the end of this entire workshop series. Once again, it's been a collaborative project of Music NL, the Canadian Federation of Musicians, and Memorial University School of Music. Thanks to all our sponsors again. Thank you guys for coming. It's been a very informative workshop. I get the sense there's a big, vast world that people can dive into and explore infinitely if we just want to do it. That's kind of the vibe I'm getting from all of you. That sound about right?
Go for it.
Yeah.
And I think we weren't being funny before when we said we were all resources. I think I can speak for me. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to answer the questions, and don't be afraid to reach out kind of out of the blue and ask what the hell. Remember that thing you talked about in the session? What the heck? Don't remember what the hell it was. Can you explain to me what a cue sheet is again, or something like that? I think most of us are pretty happy to answer those questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we get a round of applause for all the presenters.
Thanks for having us.
As well as the audiovisual team, who have been great throughout this entire workshop series. Thank you so much. Cool. Good night.